The restaurant manager dismissed my food poisoning complaint. Then they saw my health department credentials. The manager smiled at me with the kind of condescension usually reserved for people claiming their horoscope predicted lottery numbers. His name tag read, Dylan Cortez, General Manager, and he'd positioned himself behind the host stand like it was a fortress wall protecting him from unreasonable customers. I'd been waiting 20 minutes for him to emerge from the kitchen, watching servers navigate around me with practiced avoidance while my stomach cramped with increasing intensity. When he finally appeared, he'd already decided I was a problem to manage rather than a legitimate concern to address. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset about your experience last night," Dylan said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy that made my jaw clench. "But the Riverside Grill has been serving this community for 15 years with an impeccable reputation. We've never had a food safety issue, not once." He gestured broadly at the dining room behind him, currently hosting the lunch rush with what looked like 80% capacity. White tablecloths, soft lighting, the gentle murmur of conversation and clinking silverware. Everything designed to project upscale reliability. "I'm sure whatever you experienced was just an unfortunate coincidence. Perhaps something you ate elsewhere, or a stomach bug that happened to coincide with your visit here." I'd come to the Riverside Grill the previous evening for what was supposed to be a quiet birthday dinner with my husband, our first real date night in 3 months. Work had been consuming lately, the kind of all-hands crisis management that left me checking emails at midnight and skipping lunch to handle emergencies. But I'd blocked off Friday evening, made a reservation at this restaurant everyone raved about, wore the dress that had been hanging in my closet waiting for a special occasion. The evening had started perfectly. Warm greeting from the hostess, prompt seating with a view of the river, attentive server named Kelsey who'd recommended the pan-seared halibut with lemon butter sauce. The food had been beautifully presented, the fish flaky and tender, the risotto creamy and rich. We'd shared a bottle of Pinot Grigio and talked about everything except work. For 2 hours, I'd felt like a person instead of a professional crisis responder. The symptoms had started around 11 that night. Mild nausea that I'd initially attributed to perhaps drinking the wine too quickly or eating more than I was used to after weeks of grab-and-go meals. But by midnight, I was in the bathroom with violent cramping and diarrhea. By 2 in the morning, I was vomiting every 20 minutes while my husband stood helplessly in the doorway, asking if he should take me to the emergency room. By dawn, I was weak, dehydrated, and furious. I'd spent my career in public health. I knew food poisoning when I experienced it. The timing, the symptoms, the progression, everything pointed to bacterial contamination in what I'd eaten. And the only thing I'd eaten the previous day that my husband hadn't shared was that halibut. Standing in the Riverside Grill's entrance now, still feeling shaky and dehydrated despite forcing down electrolyte drinks all morning, I tried to maintain my composure while Dylan Cortez dismissed my legitimate complaint. "I'm not speculating about coincidences," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm reporting a case of what I strongly suspect is bacterial food poisoning from the halibut I was served here last night. I'm asking you to check your fish supplier, your refrigeration logs, your cooking temperatures. This is a serious food safety concern." Dylan's smile didn't waver. "I appreciate your concern, really I do. But our kitchen operates under the strictest health standards. Our head chef, Ramon Silva, has been with us for 12 years. He's trained in food safety protocols, and our entire staff undergoes regular certification. The likelihood that we served contaminated food is virtually zero." He pulled out a tablet from beneath the host stand, tapping through screens. "I'm looking at our health inspection reports right now. Perfect scores for the past 5 years. Not a single violation. That kind of record doesn't happen by accident, ma'am. It happens because we take food safety seriously." The presumption in his voice made my hands tighten around my purse strap. I'd come here as a customer seeking accountability, deliberately not leading with my professional credentials because I wanted to see how this establishment handled complaints from ordinary people. The answer was becoming clear. They didn't handle them at all. They dismissed them with practiced corporate speak and smug references to their spotless record. "I'd like to speak with the owner," I said. "This conversation clearly isn't productive." "The owner is out of the country on vacation," Dylan replied, his tone suggesting this was convenient timing. "But I assure you, I have full authority to handle customer concerns. And in this case, my assessment is that the Riverside Grill bears no responsibility for your illness. I'm sorry you had a bad night, but that's not the same as us serving contaminated food." He glanced past me toward the door where new customers were waiting. "If you'd like, I can offer you a complimentary appetizer on your next visit as a gesture of goodwill, but that's the extent of what I can do." A complimentary appetizer. As compensation for 12 hours of violent illness. The offer was so insulting I almost laughed. "You're not even going to investigate my complaint? Not going to check your logs or talk to your kitchen staff?" Dylan shook his head with exaggerated patience. "Ma'am, I've already told you our kitchen operates at the highest standards. Investigating every customer who claims they got sick would be a waste of resources, especially when there's no evidence linking your illness to our establishment. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other guests to attend to." He gestured toward the waiting customers with the clear expectation that I would leave. I reached into my purse and pulled out my credentials. The official identification card from the State Department of Public Health, Environmental Health Division. My photo next to my title, Senior Food Safety Inspector, 13 years of service. I'd conducted over 2,000 restaurant inspections in my career, shut down establishments for critical violations, testified in court cases involving foodborne illness outbreaks. I knew every regulation, every protocol, every excuse operators used when they'd cut corners, and I knew exactly what Dylan Cortez's refusal to investigate my complaint actually meant. Either he was incompetent, or he already knew there was a problem he didn't want documented. I set the credentials on the host stand where Dylan couldn't avoid seeing them. Actually, I think we should continue this conversation. I'm Vanessa Kingsley, Senior Food Safety Inspector for the State Department of Public Health. This is my jurisdiction. And you just told me that a documented case of suspected foodborne illness from your establishment isn't worth investigating. So let's try this again. I'm filing an official complaint regarding suspected food contamination at the Riverside Grill. You're going to provide me with your food supplier documentation, your temperature logs for the past week, and access to your walk-in refrigeration units. Right now. The transformation in Dylan's face was instant and almost comical. The condescending smile vanished, replaced by wide-eyed panic. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly for several seconds. The color drained from his face as he stared at my credentials, then at me, then back at the credentials. Inspector Kingsley, he stammered, suddenly using my title. I had no idea. You should have identified yourself when you arrived. We would have handled this completely differently. The admission was revealing. They would have handled it differently not because my complaint had merit, but because I had authority. The same symptoms, the same timeline, the same evidence. But now it mattered because I could affect their business license. Why should my professional identity change the validity of my complaint? I asked. A customer reporting food poisoning deserves investigation regardless of who they work for, unless you only take food safety seriously when someone with enforcement power is watching. Dylan scrambled to recover. Of course not. We take all complaints seriously. I just meant that we have procedures for official inspections that are different from customer service protocols. Let me get Chef Silva out here immediately, and our food safety coordinator. We'll provide whatever documentation you need. He was already typing frantically on his tablet, presumably messaging the kitchen. The panic in his movements suggested he knew exactly what I might find if I started pulling records. Within minutes, the dining room manager had appeared to escort waiting customers to their tables, while Dylan led me back through the kitchen doors. The Riverside Grill's kitchen was larger than I'd expected, with multiple cooking stations, a prep area, and what looked like recently upgraded equipment. At first glance, everything appeared organized and clean. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under bright lights. Staff wore proper uniforms and hair restraints. But I'd been doing this job long enough to know that surface appearances meant nothing. The real problems were always in the details. The temperature logs that showed inconsistent cold holding, the cutting boards stored with visible score marks where bacteria could harbor, the hand sinks without soap or paper towels. Chef Ramon Silva emerged from the walk-in cooler carrying a stack of clipboard. He was a stocky man in his late 50s with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades in professional kitchens. He looked annoyed at being summoned, an expression that shifted to concern when Dylan whispered something in his ear and gestured toward me. Inspector Kingsley, Ramon said, his voice carefully neutral. Dylan tells me you had an unfortunate experience dining with us last night. I'm very sorry to hear that. How can I help? I need to see your fish supplier documentation, I said. Specifically, your receiving records and temperature logs for any halibut delivered in the past week. I also need to see your cooking temperature logs and your refrigeration unit temperature records. I pulled out my phone and opened the health department's incident report application. Even though I was technically off duty and this had started as a personal complaint, the moment Dylan had dismissed the food safety concern, it had become an official matter. I had an obligation to investigate. Ramon glanced at Dylan, who gave a slight nod. Of course, our records are very thorough. We maintain everything digitally now, makes it much easier for inspections. He led me to a small office off the kitchen where a computer monitor displayed what looked like a food safety management system. All our deliveries are logged here with receiving temperatures. Temperature checks for all cold holding units are recorded every 4 hours. Cooking temps are logged for everything that requires it. He clicked through screens with practiced efficiency, pulling up the records I'd requested. I leaned closer to examine the data. The halibut delivery from the previous Monday showed a receiving temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, within the acceptable range for fresh fish. Subsequent cold holding temperatures in the walk-in showed consistent readings of 36 to 38 degrees. Cooking temperature logs for halibut preparations showed internal temps of 145 degrees Fahrenheit, the minimum required for fish. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect, actually. In 13 years of inspections, I'd learned that when records looked flawless, it usually meant one of two things. Either the operation was genuinely exceptional, or someone was falsifying documentation. These are your daily logs? I asked, scrolling back through the previous week. Every single entry showed the same pattern. Temperatures exactly where they should be, recorded at precisely the right intervals, no variations or anomalies. Yes, ma'am, Ramon confirmed. We're very consistent about our protocols. Our staff knows that food safety isn't negotiable. He said it with pride, but something in his tone made me suspicious. The defensive edge suggested he was trying too hard to convince me. I stood up from the computer. I'd like to see the actual walk-in units and verify the thermometers against these recorded temperatures. Ramon's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, the walk-in is right through here. He led me past the cooking line where several cooks had stopped working to watch us with barely concealed anxiety. Their nervousness told me more than any documentation could. These weren't employees confident in their workplace safety practices. These were people worried about what an inspector might find. The walk-in refrigerator was a large unit, maybe 12 feet by 8 feet, with heavy insulated doors and multiple shelving units inside. Ramon pulled the door open and gestured for me to enter. Cold air rushed out, carrying the mixed scents of produce, dairy, and seafood. I stepped inside and immediately checked the wall-mounted thermometer. It read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Acceptable. I pulled out my own calibrated digital thermometer from my purse and took several ambient air readings in different parts of the unit. They ranged from 33 to 36 degrees, all within the safe zone. But then I noticed something odd. There were 2 thermometers on the wall. The official one that Ramon had pointed to, and a second one partially hidden behind a shelf of lettuce. The second thermometer read 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees above the safe maximum for cold holding. I moved the lettuce aside to get a clear view. Chef Silva, why are there 2 thermometers in here? Ramon's face flushed. The second one is broken. We've been meaning to remove it but haven't gotten around to it. We only use the primary thermometer for our temperature logs. He pointed to the one showing 34 degrees. I pulled the broken thermometer off the wall and examined it. The glass tube was intact, the mercury column clearly visible and stable. It didn't look broken. It looked like it was reading the actual temperature while the official thermometer had been manipulated to show a false reading. This thermometer appears to be functioning normally, I said, my voice hardening. And it's showing a temperature 8 degrees higher than your official reading. That's a critical violation, Chef Silva. If your actual cold holding temperature is above 41 degrees, everything in this walk-in is potentially in the temperature danger zone. Ramon started to object, but I cut him off. I'm going to verify this with my own equipment. Then we're going to have a serious conversation about documentation fraud. I spent the next 15 minutes taking temperature readings throughout the walk-in using my calibrated thermometer. The results were damning. Actual temperatures in different areas of the unit ranged from 42 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the maximum safe temperature of 41 degrees. The fish, including the halibut I'd eaten the night before, had been stored in the danger zone where bacteria multiply rapidly. No wonder I'd gotten sick. I documented everything with photos and detailed notes in my inspection app. Ramon stood silently, his earlier defensive confidence completely collapsed. Dylan had appeared in the doorway, watching with growing horror as the extent of the problem became clear. This is a critical violation, I said, my voice cold and professional. Your refrigeration unit is failing to maintain safe temperatures, and based on your falsified logs, this has been ongoing for at least a week. Everything in this walk-in needs to be discarded immediately. And I'm shutting down your cold food service until this unit is repaired and verified to be holding at safe temperatures. You can't shut us down, Dylan said, panic cracking through his professional veneer. We have reservations booked solid through the weekend. We'll lose tens of thousands of dollars. I turned to face him directly. You should have thought about that before serving food from a malfunctioning refrigeration unit and falsifying your temperature logs. This is exactly the kind of violation that causes foodborne illness outbreaks. I got sick from your halibut. How many other customers have been affected but didn't report it? How many assumed, like you told me to assume, that their illness was just a coincidence? The question hung in the air. Ramon finally spoke, his voice subdued. The refrigeration unit started having problems about 2 weeks ago. The temperature would fluctuate, especially during busy service periods when we were opening and closing the door frequently. I called the repair company, but they said it would take a week to get the parts we needed. I didn't want to throw out thousands of dollars in inventory, so I thought if we were careful about rotating stock and cooking everything to temp, we could make it work until the repair was completed. You thought wrong, I said flatly. And then you falsified your temperature logs to hide the problem. That's not just a mistake, Chef Silva. That's a deliberate violation of food safety regulations. You knowingly served food stored at unsafe temperatures and created false documentation to cover it up. I pulled up the enforcement section of my inspection app. I'm issuing an immediate closure order for all cold food service. You can continue to serve items that don't require refrigeration until you get that unit repaired, and I can verify it's maintaining proper temperatures. You're also facing a formal citation for critical violations and documentation fraud. The fine for this will likely be in the $5,000 range at minimum. Dylan looks like he might be sick himself. Inspector Kingsley, please. Is there any way we can work this out? We made a mistake, but we're willing to fix it immediately. We'll discard everything in the walk-in right now. We'll get the repair company out here today. We'll do whatever you need. The pleading was pathetic, especially considering how he'd dismissed my initial complaint. You already had the opportunity to work this out, I said. When I came to you as a customer reporting suspected food poisoning, you could have investigated. You could have checked your equipment and your logs. Instead, you brushed me off and told me your restaurant was above reproach. Now we're here, and I'm doing my job. I continued the inspection, examining the rest of the kitchen with increased scrutiny. Once you find one major violation, you always find more. The hand-washing sink near the prep area had no soap dispenser. The cutting boards showed deep score marks and staining that indicated they needed replacement. The 3-compartment sink being used for dishwashing had sanitizer solution that tested below minimum concentration. Each violation went into my report with photographic documentation. By the time I finished, I'd documented 8 critical violations and a dozen non-critical infractions. The Riverside Grill's perfect inspection record was about to be very thoroughly destroyed. I'm posting the closure notice for cold food service on your front door, I told Dylan as I saved my inspection report. You're required to keep it posted until I've re-inspected and verified compliance. I'll be back in 3 days. If your refrigeration unit isn't repaired and functioning properly by then, the partial closure becomes a full closure. Understood? Dylan nodded mutely, all his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. We'll have it fixed. I'll call the repair company right now. I handed him a printed copy of the violation notice. You should also be aware that I'm reporting this incident to my supervisor. Given the documentation fraud and the confirmed case of foodborne illness, this will likely trigger a more comprehensive investigation. You may have inspectors from the central office conducting a full compliance audit. The words hit him like physical blows. A full compliance audit meant weeks of scrutiny, examining everything from employee training records to equipment maintenance logs to supplier certifications. If they found more evidence of corner cutting or falsification, the Riverside Grill could face license suspension or even permanent closure. As I walked out of the kitchen, I passed servers who were already beginning to realize something was very wrong. The lunch service was about to get complicated when customers started asking why half the menu items were suddenly unavailable. I posted the official closure notice on the front door, a bright orange document that detailed the critical violations and the restricted service. People walking past on the street stopped to read it, some taking photos with their phones. The damage to the Riverside Grill's reputation was immediate and public. Inside, I could see Dylan on his phone, presumably calling the owner to explain how a simple customer complaint had turned into a health department shutdown. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly, but I felt a grim sense of justice. They'd gambled that their perfect record and community reputation would let them dismiss legitimate food safety concerns. They'd lost that gamble the moment they'd dismissed mine. My husband called as I was getting into my car. "How did it go?" he asked. "Please tell me you shut them down." I started the engine, exhaustion from the lingering illness and the confrontation suddenly hitting me hard. Partial shutdown. They can't serve anything requiring refrigeration until they fix their cooling unit and I re-inspect. And they're getting cited for multiple critical violations, including documentation fraud. I filled him in on the details as I drove home. The falsified temperature logs, the failing refrigeration unit, Ramon's admission that he'd knowingly served food from the danger zone to avoid losing inventory. "Unbelievable," my husband said. "And they tried to tell you it was probably just a stomach bug." The anger in his voice mirrored what I'd been feeling all morning. "Well, at least you caught them before more people got sick. Although there are probably other victims who just didn't report it." He was right. Food poisoning cases were notoriously underreported. Most people experienced symptoms, suffered through them, and never connected their illness to a specific meal. The ones who did report often faced exactly what I'd faced from Dylan: dismissal, deflection, blame shifting. Only I'd had the authority and knowledge to push back. I spent Saturday resting and hydrating, my body still recovering from the previous night's illness. But my mind kept circling back to the Riverside Grill. The falsified temperature logs bothered me more than the equipment failure. Equipment breaks. That's unfortunate but manageable if you handle it properly. Falsifying documentation to hide a known hazard was different. That showed a willingness to prioritize profit over safety, to gamble with customers' health. And if they'd been willing to do that with temperature logs, what else might they have falsified? Monday morning, I met with my supervisor, Gordon Chesterfield, director of the Environmental Health Division for our regional office. Gordon had been in public health for 30 years, a detail-oriented administrator who'd built his career on thorough enforcement and zero tolerance for violations that put the public at risk. I'd worked under him for 8 years and respected his judgment. When I walked him through what I'd found at the Riverside Grill, his expression grew progressively darker. "Documentation fraud is always a red flag," he said, leaning back in his chair. "If they were willing to falsify temperature logs, we need to know what else they might have covered up. I'm authorizing a full compliance audit. Pull their complete inspection history, interview their staff, examine all their supplier documentation. If there's a pattern here, I want it found." He assigned another inspector, Patricia Nguyen, to work with me on the audit. Patricia was relatively new to the division, only 3 years in, but she was meticulous and had a particular talent for finding inconsistencies in documentation. Together, we spent Monday afternoon pulling 5 years of inspection reports for the Riverside Grill. Gordon had been right. The record was too perfect. In 5 years and 20 routine inspections, they'd never had a single critical violation, never had equipment failure, never had a food handling problem. For a high-volume restaurant operating 7 days a week, that level of perfection was statistically improbable. "Look at this," Patricia said, pointing to a series of inspection reports from different inspectors. Every single inspection shows cold holding temperatures at exactly 38 degrees. Not 37, not 39, always 38. That's not natural variation. That suggests someone knew what number to write down regardless of what the actual temperature was. She pulled up the inspection photos attached to each report. In every single photo of the walk-in thermometer, the reading showed 38 degrees. Either their refrigeration unit is incredibly precise, or someone's been staging these inspections. The implications made my stomach turn. Staging inspections meant knowing when the inspector was coming and preparing accordingly, making sure the thermometers showed the right readings, making sure all the soap dispensers were filled, making sure the sanitizer solution tested at proper concentration. Then, after the inspector left, going back to whatever corner-cutting practices they'd been using. It was a level of deception that required coordination and planning. "We need to do an unannounced inspection," I said, "not during the re-inspection window I gave them. A separate compliance check when they don't know we're coming." Gordon approved the unannounced inspection for Wednesday morning at 10, early enough that they'd be in prep mode for lunch service, late enough that morning deliveries would have arrived. Patricia and I arrived together, entering through the front door before any staff could alert the kitchen. The dining room was empty except for 2 servers setting tables. They looked up in surprise when they saw us. "Health inspection," I said, showing my credentials. "We need to speak with your manager immediately." Dylan appeared within minutes, his face going pale when he recognized me. "Inspector Kingsley, I thought you were coming Friday for the re-inspection." His tone carried an edge of accusation, as if unannounced inspections were somehow unfair. "This is a separate compliance audit," I explained. "We'll still conduct the re-inspection Friday to verify your refrigeration unit repair. Today we're examining your overall food safety program." I didn't give him time to prepare or make phone calls. Patricia and I headed directly to the kitchen. The difference from my previous visit was stark. The walk-in refrigerator door was propped open with a milk crate, clearly to maintain temperature while the unit was under repair. But inside, there was still food being stored. I checked the ambient temperature with my thermometer. 49 degrees Fahrenheit, completely unsafe. "Chef Silva," I called out, spotting Ramon at the prep station. "Why is there food in this walk-in when it's running at 49 degrees? Ramon turned, saw me, and his expression went from surprised to resigned. "The repair company couldn't get here until tomorrow. We have deliveries arriving all morning. I didn't want to waste them, so I figured we could keep the door propped to maintain some cooling until the unit is fixed." The logic was insane. Propping the door open doesn't maintain safe temperatures. You're creating a bacteria incubator. I grabbed my phone and started documenting. Containers of raw chicken sitting at 49 degrees. Fresh fish on ice in bus tubs because there was no functioning cold storage. Dairy products stacked on shelves in a unit that was barely cooler than room temperature. Every single item was in immediate danger of bacterial growth. "All of this food needs to be discarded, right now, and your cold service shutdown is now a full shutdown. You can't operate a restaurant without functioning refrigeration." Dylan had followed us into the kitchen. When he heard full shutdown, he actually grabbed my arm. "You can't do this. We've been booking parties, taking reservations. We have a wedding reception scheduled for Saturday with 100 guests. You're destroying our business over a refrigerator that's getting fixed tomorrow." I yanked my arm away from his grip. "Don't touch me. And yes, I can do this. You're operating in flagrant violation of the partial closure I issued. You were explicitly told you could only serve items not requiring refrigeration. Instead, you're storing potentially hazardous foods at unsafe temperatures. This is exactly the kind of violation that causes mass foodborne illness outbreaks." Patricia was photographing everything, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented each violation. She'd moved on to examining the dry storage area and had found rodent droppings behind bags of flour. "Inspector Kingsley, you need to see this," she called. The droppings were fresh, scattered across the floor and on lower shelves. Evidence of active rodent infestation. I added it to the growing list of violations. "When was your last pest control service?" I asked Dylan. He fumbled for his phone, scrolling through emails. "We have a monthly contract with A+ Pest Management. They were here 3 weeks ago." "Do you have documentation of the service?" Patricia asked. Dylan showed her an email confirmation of the appointment, but there was no service report attached. No documentation of what areas were treated or what pest activity was found. "I need to see actual service reports," Patricia said. "The pest control company is required to provide detailed documentation of each visit." Dylan made a call to the pest control company while Patricia and I continued the inspection. What we were finding painted a picture of an operation that had been cutting corners for far longer than just the recent refrigeration failure. The 3-compartment sink showed visible buildup of grease and food debris in the corners, suggesting it wasn't being properly cleaned between uses. The floor drains had standing water with visible slime, a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Several of the hand-washing sinks throughout the kitchen had no paper towels, just shared cloth towels hanging on hooks. Each observation went into our report, building a comprehensive case of systemic food safety failures. When Patricia checked the employee bathroom, she found it also lacked soap and paper towels. "How are employees supposed to wash their hands before returning to food prep?" she asked Dylan. We usually have supplies, Dylan said weakly. Someone must have forgotten to restock them. But the condition of the dispensers suggested they'd been empty for a while, not just forgotten that morning. The soap dispenser in the kitchen hand sink had visible dust on it, indicating it hadn't been used recently. Our inspection lasted 3 hours. By the time we finished, we documented 23 critical violations and 34 non-critical infractions. The scope of the problems was far beyond what could be explained by a single equipment failure or recent negligence. This was an operation that had been systematically violating food safety standards while maintaining a facade of compliance for official inspections. The Riverside Grill is being issued a full closure order effective immediately, I told Dylan as Patricia and I compiled our findings. You're not to serve any food until all critical violations are corrected and you've passed a comprehensive reinspection. Given the severity and number of violations, including evidence of documentation fraud from previous inspections, I'm also recommending license suspension proceedings. The words hit Dylan like a death sentence. License suspension? That could take weeks. We'll go bankrupt. You're destroying 15 years of business over some refrigeration problems and missed restocking. The minimization was infuriating. These aren't minor oversights, I said, my voice hard. You have critical violations in multiple areas: food storage, pest control, sanitation, employee hygiene, and evidence suggests these problems have existed for far longer than you're admitting. This isn't about punishment, it's about protecting public health. I handed him the official closure notice, a red document that was even more serious than the orange partial closure I'd posted Friday. This needs to be posted on your front door immediately. Any attempt to continue service will result in criminal charges. As Patricia and I walked out, I could hear Dylan on his phone, presumably calling the owner again. The wedding reception for Saturday would need to be canceled or moved to another venue. The reservations booked through the following weeks would need to be contacted. The financial damage was going to be substantial, but it was nothing compared to the potential damage of a major foodborne illness outbreak. We'd likely prevented dozens or hundreds of people from getting sick. That was worth any business consequences the Riverside Grill faced. Back at the office, Gordon reviewed our inspection report with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd suspected problems and been proven right. This is going to the legal division, he said. Documentation fraud, operating during a closure, multiple critical violations. They're going to face significant penalties beyond just the reinspection requirements. He pulled up his email and started drafting the referral. I'm also going to recommend we pull inspection records for other restaurants managed by the same ownership group. If this is happening at the Riverside Grill, it might be happening at their other locations. The legal division was headed by Neil Covington, an attorney who'd spent 20 years prosecuting food safety violations and public health crimes. He contacted me Thursday morning for a detailed interview about everything I'd observed. I walked him through the timeline starting with my personal experience of food poisoning, Dylan's dismissive response to my initial complaint, and everything Patricia and I had found during our inspections. The documentation fraud is what makes this serious, Neil said, making notes on a legal pad. Equipment fails, that happens. But falsifying temperature logs and staging inspections shows intent. It shows they knew they were violating standards and chose to hide it rather than correct it. He asked detailed questions about the previous inspection photos showing consistent 38-degree readings, about whether I believed those inspections had been legitimate or staged, about the timeline of when the refrigeration unit had started failing and how long they'd continued operating with it malfunctioning. I'm going to need to interview the staff, he said. Find out what they knew about the falsified logs. Find out if management pressured them to cover up violations during inspections. Build a complete picture of the organizational culture here. The staff interviews happened over the following week. Neil's investigators spoke with current and former employees of the Riverside Grill, and the stories they told were damning. Multiple line cooks confirmed that Chef Silva had instructed them to adjust the official walk-in thermometer before inspections to show the proper temperature regardless of actual readings. Servers described being told to make sure soap and paper towels were stocked in all bathrooms before scheduled inspections, even though they were often empty during regular operations. The prep cook admitted that temperature logs were often filled out at the end of the day, rather than at the required intervals, with staff simply writing down the numbers they knew inspectors wanted to see. One former employee, a sous chef named Yelena Volkov who'd quit 3 months earlier, provided particularly detailed testimony. She described a culture where food safety rules were treated as obstacles to efficiency rather than necessary protections, where ingredients were used past their expiration dates to avoid waste, where cleaning schedules existed on paper but weren't actually followed, where the priority was always keeping costs down and service fast, with safety a distant third consideration. I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore, Yelena told the investigators. I told Ramon and Dylan multiple times that we were going to make someone seriously sick. They said I was being paranoid and that they'd been running the restaurant for 15 years without problems. Except they had caused problems. As word of the investigation spread, other customers started coming forward with their own experiences. A woman named Claire Whitmore had been hospitalized with severe food poisoning 6 months earlier after eating at the Riverside Grill. She'd reported her illness to the restaurant and been offered a refund but nothing more. A family had all gotten sick after a birthday dinner there in December. A man had experienced symptoms consistent with salmonella poisoning after eating their chicken parmesan in October. None of these cases had been officially investigated because none of the victims had known to report them to the health department. They'd reported to the restaurant, been placated with apologies and gift cards, and sent on their way. Neil's office compiled all these cases into a comprehensive complaint that painted the Riverside Grill as a serial violator that had been endangering public health for years while hiding behind a facade of compliance. The formal charges were filed in early June, 3 weeks after my initial complaint. The Riverside Grill and its ownership group were charged with multiple counts of operating in violation of health codes, documentation fraud, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to conceal public health hazards. The penalties could include fines up to $50,000, permanent license revocation, and potential criminal charges against the owner and management. The story hit local news media hard. Food safety violations at upscale restaurants had a particular resonance because people expected better from establishments with higher prices and polished reputations. The local TV station ran a segment featuring interviews with victims of food poisoning from the Riverside Grill, including me. I explained on camera how I'd initially come to the restaurant as a regular customer, gotten sick, been dismissed when I complained, and then discovered extensive violations when I returned as an inspector. The segment showed photos from our inspection, the failing refrigeration unit, the rodent droppings, the falsified temperature logs. The public reaction was swift and brutal. The Riverside Grill's social media pages were flooded with angry comments from former customers sharing their own bad experiences. Reviews on dining websites plummeted as people posted about their illnesses and the investigation. The owner, Thomas Ashford, finally emerged from his vacation to hold a press conference where he claimed to be shocked by the violations and blamed rogue employees for the problems. He announced that Dylan Cortez had been fired and that Chef Ramon Silva had resigned. He promised comprehensive reforms and begged for a chance to rebuild trust. But the damage was too extensive. Even if the Riverside Grill eventually passed re-inspection and had their license restored, the reputational harm was permanent. Within 2 months, Thomas Ashford announced the restaurant was closing permanently. The building would be sold, the equipment liquidated. 15 years of business ended because they'd chosen to cut corners and hide violations rather than maintain proper food safety standards. The closure was extensively covered in local media as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing profit over public health. The legal case proceeded through administrative hearings and settlement negotiations. Neil Covington was relentless in building the prosecution's case, presenting documentation of every violation, every falsified log, every victim who'd been sickened. The defense tried arguing that the violations were isolated incidents, management failures rather than organizational policy, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. In August, Thomas Ashford and his ownership group agreed to a settlement that included $45,000 in fines, permanent surrender of their food service licenses, and an agreement not to operate any food service establishments in the state for 10 years. Ramon Silva faced separate charges for his role in falsifying temperature logs. As the head chef responsible for food safety compliance, he'd knowingly created false documentation and instructed staff to do the same. His case went to trial, where several former employees testified about his instructions to manipulate thermometers and fabricate logs. The jury convicted him on 3 counts of documentation fraud and 1 count of reckless endangerment. His sentence included 18 months probation, $5,000 in fines, and permanent revocation of his food handler certification. He'd never work as a chef again. Dylan Cortez avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators and providing testimony about the organizational pressure to maintain the restaurant's perfect inspection record. He described how Thomas Ashford had explicitly told management that violations were unacceptable because they would damage the restaurant's reputation and reduce property value when he eventually sold the business. The message was clear: maintain appearances regardless of actual compliance. Dylan's cooperation was self-serving, but it provided crucial evidence about the systemic nature of the violations. 6 months after my initial complaint, I was invited to speak at a food safety conference about the case. The conference was attended by hundreds of restaurant operators, health inspectors, and industry professionals. I presented a detailed timeline of events, from my experience as a customer through the investigation and legal proceedings. The audience was particularly interested in how my professional knowledge had shaped my response to being dismissed. Several restaurant operators admitted they'd probably have handled a similar complaint the same way Dylan had, assuming the customer was wrong or exaggerating. The case had made them reconsider that approach. During Quanda, someone asked if I regretted eating at the Riverside Grill, given what I knew about inspection processes. I've been a food safety inspector for 13 years, I said. I know that inspection records only capture a moment in time. I know that perfect scores don't guarantee perfect practices, but I also can't live my life assuming every restaurant is hiding violations. The Riverside Grill had a 15-year reputation and consistently high scores. They should have been safe. The fact that they weren't is exactly why we need robust enforcement, and why complaints must be taken seriously, regardless of who makes them. Another questioner asked about the broader implications for inspection processes. If the Riverside Grill had been successfully hiding violations for years, how many other restaurants were doing the same? It was a question that kept me up at night. We've strengthened our inspection protocols based on this case, I explained. More unannounced inspections, more scrutiny of operators with perfect records, more aggressive follow-up on customer complaints. But fundamentally, the system relies on operators choosing to comply with food safety standards even when no one is watching. Cases like this show what happens when that trust is violated. The conference led to speaking invitations from other jurisdictions wanting to learn from the case. I presented to health departments in 3 other states about identifying documentation fraud and recognizing patterns that suggested staged inspections. The case became a training example used in food safety courses, illustrating the importance of thorough investigation and the consequences of dismissing customer complaints. My personal experience of getting sick and being dismissed resonated with people in a way that abstract policy discussions never could. A year after the closure, the building that had housed the Riverside Grill was purchased by a different restaurant group. They completely renovated the space, installed all new equipment, and brought in a management team with sterling reputations and genuine commitment to food safety. They invited me to conduct a pre-opening inspection as a public relations gesture, showing they had nothing to hide. The new operation was everything the old one had pretended to be. Properly functioning refrigeration with multiple redundant temperature monitoring systems, comprehensive staff training programs, transparent documentation processes, genuine commitment to compliance rather than just appearance of compliance. I still thought about that Saturday morning when I'd walked into the Riverside Grill to complain about food poisoning and been treated like an unreasonable customer looking for a free meal. Dylan Cortez's condescending smile. His absolute confidence that his restaurant's reputation protected them from accountability. The way everything had changed the moment he saw my credentials. It revealed a fundamental truth about how many businesses approach customer complaints. They don't investigate. They dismiss, deflect, and defend. Only when faced with authority do they take concerns seriously. But it also revealed something about institutional power and its limits. I'd been able to force accountability because I had professional credentials and enforcement authority. The other victims, people like Claire Whitmore, who'd been hospitalized 6 months before me, hadn't had that power. They'd been placated with refunds and apologies while the underlying problems continued. The system had failed them even though their complaints were just as valid and their suffering just as real. My credentials shouldn't have been necessary for the restaurant to investigate. The reported illness itself should have triggered proper response. That disparity drove me to push for policy changes at the departmental level. We implemented a new protocol requiring formal investigation of all reported foodborne illness complaints, regardless of the restaurant's inspection history. We created a public complaint database where people could report suspected food poisoning, making it easier to identify patterns of problems at specific establishments. We increased the frequency of unannounced inspections and trained inspectors to look for signs of staged compliance. None of these changes would prevent all violations, but they made it harder for operators to systematically hide problems the way the Riverside Grill had. 3 years after the closure, I received a message through the health department's website. It was from Dylan Cortez. He'd spent the time since leaving the Riverside Grill working in restaurant equipment sales, a job that kept him in the food service industry but away from direct food safety responsibility. His message was an apology. He wrote about realizing how wrong he'd been to dismiss my complaint, about understanding now that every customer concern deserved investigation. He described how the experience had changed his perspective on food safety and business ethics. He thanked me, bizarrely, for doing my job even though it had cost him his career. I didn't respond. His apology, while potentially sincere, came 3 years too late, and only after he'd faced consequences. Where was this understanding when I'd been standing in his restaurant, sick and asking for basic accountability? Where was this ethics when other customers had complained and been dismissed? His regret was welcome but insufficient. The real change hadn't come from his enlightenment. It had come from enforcement, from prosecution, from consequences severe enough that other operators took notice. 5 years after shutting down the Riverside Grill, I was promoted to Gordon's position when he retired. As Director of Environmental Health, I had broader authority to shape how our division approached food safety enforcement. I used that authority to build on the changes we'd implemented after the case. More resources for investigating complaints, better technology for tracking patterns across multiple establishments, stronger partnerships with law enforcement for prosecuting serious violations, training programs that helped inspectors recognize signs of systematic noncompliance rather than just checking boxes during routine visits. The Riverside Grill case became a reference point for these initiatives. When operators complained that we were being too aggressive or that violations didn't warrant serious penalties, I'd point to what had happened when violations were ignored. When budget officials questioned increased funding for enforcement, I'd show them the medical costs and public health impacts of foodborne illness outbreaks. When industry groups lobbied for lighter regulations, I'd remind policymakers that voluntary compliance hadn't prevented a 15-year-old establishment from systematically endangering customers. I never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed by Dylan Cortez. To stand there sick and scared, looking for accountability, and be told I was probably wrong about my own experience. That memory informed every policy decision I made, every training session I conducted, every enforcement action I oversaw, because I understood that behind every complaint was a person who'd trusted a restaurant to serve them safe food and had that trust violated. They deserved investigation and respect, not dismissal and deflection. And when restaurants failed to provide that response voluntarily, it was our job to force accountability through enforcement. The halibut that made me sick had been stored at 44 degrees in a failing refrigeration unit that management knew was broken. That single piece of fish had been the evidence that unraveled 15 years of hidden violations and systematic fraud. It had cost the Riverside Grill their business, cost Ramon Silva his career, cost Thomas Ashford hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees. All because they'd chosen to hide problems rather than fix them. All because they'd assumed their reputation would shield them from consequences. They'd been wrong, and I'd made sure everyone in the industry knew it. Standing at the front of a conference room 7 years after the closure, presenting the case to a new class of food safety inspectors, I emphasized the lessons that mattered most. Take every complaint seriously. Look beyond surface appearances. Verify documentation rather than accepting it at face value. Understand that perfect records can be red flags rather than proof of compliance. And remember that enforcement isn't about punishment. It's about protecting people who trust that the food they're served won't make them sick. The inspectors in training listened intently as I walked through photos from the investigation. The falsified temperature logs, the failing refrigeration unit, the rodent droppings and unsanitary conditions. Then I showed them the photo of myself from the news segment, looking tired and angry as I explained how I'd been dismissed when I first complained. This could happen to any customer, I told them. The difference is that I had the knowledge and authority to fight back. Your job is to be that protection for people who don't. To investigate when they report problems, to hold establishments accountable when they cut corners, to remember that behind every violation is a potential victim. The training class was part of the lasting impact of the case. We'd built better systems, trained better inspectors, created stronger enforcement mechanisms. The Riverside Grill was gone, but the lessons from their failures continued protecting public health years later. That was the real victory. Not the closure or the fines or the convictions, but the institutional changes that meant fewer people would experience what I had. Fewer people would be dismissed when they reported illness. Fewer restaurants would be able to hide systematic violations behind staged inspections and falsified logs. I still avoided eating fish at restaurants. The psychological association between halibut and 12 hours of violent illness never fully faded. But I continued dining out regularly, continued trusting that most establishments genuinely prioritized food safety. The Riverside Grill had been an outlier, a particularly egregious example of what happened when profit took precedence over safety. Most restaurants operated honestly, maintained proper standards, treated customer complaints seriously. The system worked most of the time. My job was ensuring it worked all the time, or as close to all the time as human enforcement could achieve. 10 years after that Saturday morning complaint, I could look back and see the full arc of impact. One case of food poisoning had exposed systematic fraud, ended a business, changed enforcement policies, and strengthened public health protection across multiple jurisdictions. It had started with me being sick and angry, seeking basic accountability, and being told I was wrong. It had ended with lasting institutional change and dozens of other potential victims protected from similar violations. That transformation from personal injury to systemic reform was why I'd chosen public health as a career. Individual cases mattered, but the real work was building systems that prevented future harm. The Riverside Grill's closure notice had hung on their door for 60 days before the building was sold. Every person who walked past it saw evidence that violations had consequences, that perfect reputations didn't guarantee immunity from enforcement, that dismissing customer complaints was a choice that could destroy a business. The notice was eventually removed when the new owners took over, but the lesson remained. In the food service industry, people still talked about what had happened when a restaurant dismissed a complaint from someone who turned out to be a health inspector. The story had become a cautionary tale, shared in trade publications and industry forums as a warning about the importance of taking food safety seriously. Some operators complained that the case had made inspectors too aggressive, too willing to shut down establishments over minor violations. I pushed back hard against that characterization. The Riverside Grill hadn't been shut down over minor violations. They'd been shut down for systematic fraud, critical violations in multiple areas, and evidence of endangering public health for years. That wasn't aggression. That was appropriate enforcement. And if it made other operators more careful about compliance, more responsive to customer complaints, more honest in their documentation, then the case had served its purpose beyond just the specific penalties imposed. I thought about the wedding reception that had been scheduled for the Saturday after our full shutdown. 100 guests who would have been served food from failing refrigeration units, prepared in unsanitary conditions, by staff who'd been trained to hide violations rather than correct them. How many of those guests would have gotten sick? How many would have ended up in emergency rooms or missing work or suffering through miserable nights like I had? We'd prevented that outcome. That was worth whatever business consequences the Riverside Grill faced. Public health enforcement wasn't about destroying businesses. It was about protecting people from businesses that prioritized profit over safety. The case had also changed how I approached my own inspections. I'd always been thorough, but now I looked for signs of staging with increased scrutiny. Were the temperature logs too perfect? Were all the violations I found easily visible ones that could be quickly fixed before an inspection? Was staff nervous in a way that suggested they were hiding something? The psychological tells mattered as much as the physical evidence. Operators who were genuinely committed to food safety welcomed inspections as verification of their efforts. Operators who were cutting corners treated inspections as obstacles to navigate. 15 years after shutting down the Riverside Grill, I attended a retirement party for Neil Covington, the attorney who'd prosecuted the case. He gave a speech thanking everyone he'd worked with over his career, and specifically mentioned the case as one of his most satisfying victories. "We protected public health and held a systematic violator accountable," he said. "That's what the work is supposed to be about." After the formal speeches, he pulled me aside. "You know what I remember most about that case?" he asked. "How angry you were when you first walked into my office. Not just about getting sick, but about being dismissed. That anger drove the whole investigation." He was right. The anger had been motivating and clarifying. It had pushed me to document everything meticulously, to push for the full compliance audit, to insist on comprehensive enforcement rather than just reinspection. Personal experience of being victimized and then dismissed had given me insight into how many other people faced the same treatment. That anger on behalf of all the victims who didn't have credentials or authority had shaped how I approached food safety enforcement for the rest of my career. It had made me better at my job because I understood viscerally what was at stake. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.